We're glad you've chosen to listen to our weekly Talkback. The weekly Talkback is designed to take a portion of the teaching from this week to a deeper level. You may want to listen to this week's teaching, but it isn't necessary to understand the weekly Talkback. If you'd like to connect further, feel free to reach out to us through our website, conoychurch.org. For now, enjoy the weekly Talkback from Conoy Church, where our mission is to lead people into a growing relationship with Jesus Christ.
Scott Boyer and Ethan Hall did a phenomenal job on their team teaching approach to tackling the subject of generous justice. I took a few minutes to write down some thoughts that can help us maybe lean a little bit further into this idea too. When you think about justice, whether you are a person who's been going to church for a long time or not, there's probably a single verse that comes to mind, and you wouldn't know it as a verse, you'd know it as a phrase. But we say it in popular culture. I've even heard it said in presidential speeches. And the word is eye for an eye, right? You've heard that before, eye for an eye. And that actually comes from a larger passage of Scripture. You may already know that. You may not know that. And there's actually a few places in Scripture that say eye for an eye or tooth for a tooth. But let's just take a moment this morning and let's just read Exodus chapter 21, where this comes from. And here's what the full passage says. If people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there's no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there's serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, and bruise for bruise. Now, when Moses is giving out this law, when we read the larger passage, we can see that this is pretty specific to two men arguing and fighting and accidentally hurting a pregnant woman. The funny part is that we tend to only quote one part of this scripture. And we modern day people aren't alone in this. Yeah, we do it now with our coffee cups and our little post-it notes that have a verse on them, and sometimes we have them on shirts, and we don't quote the larger passage, and so we take things out of context. We do that now and today, but even in biblical times, the same thing was done. I mean, there was hundreds and hundreds of years between when this law was given by Moses and when Jesus arrives on the scene. And by the time that Jesus arrives on the scene, people are utilizing this verse, but they're not talking about this having to do anything with two men fighting near a pregnant woman. And one of the reasons that I think they feel comfortable doing that is, like I said, there's actually a couple places that this sort of ideology is given to God's people. It shows up in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and some of their uses of this verbiage is a little less contextual. They have to do with purging evil or repaying evil for evil. But regardless, today, we want to make sure that we're not taking things out of context. And so if we're talking about this idea of justice, and the first thing that comes to mind for us, whether you're a part of church or not, is eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, then we want to pay close attention to that. So the answer is yes, there are verses in the Bible that talk about justice being an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And there's no way around that. And you might say, okay, well, if Moses is giving this to the people, we look at the even larger context of where this verse comes from, it seems like this is God giving to Moses rules for the Israelite people. And again, you would be absolutely right. So then why in the world would God give a command of eye for an eye? But when Jesus comes, hundreds and hundreds of years later, after this law has been given, Jesus says something like, "You have heard it said, an eye for an eye, but I tell you a new thing." I mean, eventually Jesus comes on the scene, and we know from the passage in Hebrews chapter 1, that Jesus, the Son, is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. Colossians 1 says almost the same thing. The Son is the image of the invisible God. So Jesus is the perfect representation of God. If we want to know how God would act or react or talk or walk or heal or love or cry, how he would struggle, how he would triumph, well, we look to Jesus because he's the exact representation of God. So when Jesus arrives on the scene, in the midst of his very famous Sermon on the Mount, you would think then that he would affirm the law that God gave to Moses and Moses gave to the people. He would say, justice is an eye for an eye. But instead he said, you've heard it said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. This feels like a very different spirit than the spirit of the law that Moses gives, right? Rather than an eye for an eye, it's turn the other cheek, which means that, well, God must have been doing something different when Moses wrote the law the way that he wrote it, or the way that he gave it. And what was that? Why is there a discrepancy, Nick? Why is there a discrepancy between the Old Testament and between the New Testament, between God and between Jesus? We know that God and Jesus are one. We don't believe in two different gods. We believe in one God. So why is there a difference? That's a great question. And it's one that we get a lot. And quite honestly, this idea of justice, this idea of an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth versus turning the other cheek, this is just a really easy way to tackle this whole question. I want you to just think back to all of the movies that you've ever watched or the books you've read about barbarians and Vikings and the Old West even. If you think back to like those times and the people that lived in those times, people would kill each other at the slightest offense, right? I mean, if we're all in the Old West and you stole some of my cattle, I might get my friends together in something called a posse and hunt you down and do a lynching, right? Or if we're back in early times of the world, or barbarians, or whatever terminology you want to use, just the earliest of people, if you hurt my family, then I would probably hurt your family. If you killed my people, I would kill your people. The thing is that back in those days and ages, there was no police force. Today, if somebody comes and steals something from your house, you call the cops, right? And the cops do an investigation. They find a criminal, and he's tried in a court of his peers, and then he's sentenced to do some sort of penance for his crime. But back in the day, there was no police. There was nobody you could call. So when somebody hurt your family or somebody stole from you, you were going to make sure that no one would ever steal from you or hurt you ever again. And how are you going to do that if there's no one to enforce it? What you're going to do is you are going to pay them back so much worse than anything they've ever done to you. If they steal crops from your field, you'll burn their fields down. If they steal some of your cattle, you'll kill all their cattle. If they do something to one of your children, you might kill their whole family. And why? Because this makes sure that no one is ever going to mess with you again. You wanted people to know, you don't mess with my family or my stuff or my property. So Moses, when he's taking what God is giving him and giving this law to the people, he's saying, okay, I know that in the past, if someone hurts you, you wipe out their whole family or their village or their tribe, whatever. But I'm giving you a law from God, a God that is a God of love. He says eye for eye, tooth for tooth. This, believe it or not, is a major step forward towards love and nonviolence. Because now there's parameters. If someone messes with your family, you're not allowed to just wipe them out. It's eye for eye. It's tooth for tooth. Rather than two men arguing and fighting and accidentally hurting a pregnant woman, rather than the person who does it, their whole family being killed, now it's an eye for an eye. See, when we look at the big picture of how God has interacted with his people over the entire length of time, mankind has not always been ready for what Jesus brought. Jesus talks about putting new wine into old wineskins and how the new wine can make the old wineskins burst. God was having that same sort of care when he slowly engages us in who he is and how he wants us to treat the world. It would have been too hard for a group of barbarians to adopt a turn the other cheek mentality. But we could take a step in that direction. So Moses helps them take a step. And over the course of the next hundreds of years, they take more steps until the world is ready for Jesus. And God, in his great providence, knows when the world is ready for Jesus. He sends Jesus, and Jesus says, I'm going to give you a new way to look at justice. Turn the other cheek. And this is something that's never been repealed. It's never been taken back. The exact representation of God. Jesus says, no longer is it eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hurt for hurt. It's now turn the other cheek. So when we talk about generous justice, when we talk about being generous with our justice, we're not talking about dealing out eye for eye. We're saying that the new covenant's idea of justice is to let God have the vengeance and for us to turn the other cheek. And this is something that we can be generous in our willingness to turn the other cheek. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves in this talkback is, who do you need to be less hurtful towards? And who do you need to be more understanding of? Who do you need to not repay back hurt for hurt? And who is it in your life that needs the other cheek? And once we answer that question, we can begin to be generous in our justice.
Hi, this is Pastor Nick. Thanks for listening. I hope something that you heard today was very helpful. If you want to connect with us further, feel free to check us out on Facebook, Instagram, or our website, KenoiChurch.org. Sure, I'm glad we're in this together.